Good evening and welcome to session 2 of Knee on My Neck, Slavery's Ghost. We thank you for joining us as we continue to look at two underlying principles of the institution of slavery in the United States and the ways these two principles have continued to be expressed through other American institutions, both governmental and private, down to the present day. We have said that the two principles are: one, financial gain through the exploitation of Blacks, and two, disavowing the humanity, the human value of Blacks, while promoting the superiority and value of whites. Whereas the prejudicial attitudes and actions of individuals are usually the focus of attention, we are saying that there are also policies and practices of institutions that continue to express the underlying principles of slavery. Thus, we use the metaphor of slavery's ghost, those attitudes and actions of both individuals and institutions that continue to haunt and inflict violence upon Blacks and other people of color in our nation. Keep in mind, however, throughout our process, that the goals of this series is to help guide us to envision and promote practical policies and actions to move us forward into a future leaving slavery's ghost behind in order to create a more equitable and just community where all are valued. Father Chuck Kramer will now lead us into the next portion of our program. Good evening, Chuck.
Good evening, Masood. Good evening, everybody. I'm delighted that you're all here. And I hope you're ready for a new dose of what I have to call a superficial historical timelines. And I don't say this to be flip, but to acknowledge that all we can do here is really review some points that we all should have learned in school, but probably didn't. These are important things for us to know, but we may not, they're pretty basic. So with the time we have, that's all we can really give you. I just trust that it will be enough to give us a context for the tensions and hopes that we experience to this day. And I hope it will help connect the dots between slavery and the dehumanization of people based on skin color, and current police violence, housing discrimination, school discrimination, employment discrimination, and voter discrimination, to name a few. You may remember in our last session, I spoke about the Civil War and the Reconstruction era and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Chris, if you have them, can you show the amendments? I just want to remind people of those amendments. So number 13, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Remember that gaping loophole, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. That's a pretty loose standard. If you can go to the next one, Chris. 14th Amendment, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deny due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction. I lost it. At any rate, you get the idea. It's the due process is the important part. And let's go to the next one. Whoops, one back, there we go. 15th Amendment, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. However, it doesn't say that it can't be denied on other grounds. So we just want to leave those out there as a reminder of what we've got going on. Now, the Reconstruction era was really seen as a time of hope and optimism But even as that was going on, these loopholes and others created they started to undermine the foundation of all that hope and optimism. And then in 1877, with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, that foundation collapsed. That very year, the Supreme Court ruled in Hall versus DeCure that states could not prohibit segregation on common carriers like trains or streetcars or riverboats. And over the next 12 years, 9 states, all in the South, enshrined that type of segregation into law. It did not take Black Southerners long to get a sense of where the winds were blowing. So starting in 1879, there was a mass exodus from the South out west. For those who stayed, things started going downhill fast. In 1882, 49 Black people were lynched throughout the South. In 1883, the Supreme Court ruled the Civil Rights Act of 1875 to be unconstitutional, strengthening their 1877 decision and stripping away protections promised in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. But in 1884, the world got to know Ida B. Wells. And Chris, if you could go to the next one, please. This is Ida B. Wells. And if you look at her, you can see a firm, steady face. I mean, this is a person who's not to be taken lightly. And she would not be taken lightly. She was, by the time she was 30, already a newspaper editor and co-owner of the newspaper. And she rejected the idea of these common carrier segregation laws. She just rejected it out flat out. So one time she was on the train and she sat in the white women's car in Memphis, Tennessee, and was kicked off. She was thrown off the train, so she sued the city of Memphis. And at first, she won. But that decision was overturned on appeal. So she organized a boycott of the train system. And then, in 1892, a friend of hers was lynched, and she did not take it lying down. She used her press to write articles opposed to this abuse. She went beyond the death of just her friend and began studying other lynchings, noting how that white people had always blamed them on the criminality of Black men. Many of them, so the story went, were allegations that Black men had raped white women. And as she traveled through the South, she discovered that none of that was true. And so she wrote in her newspaper, "Nobody in this section of the country believes the threadbare old lie that Negro men rape white women. Rather, it is an excuse to get rid of Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property and thus keep the race terrorized." That same year, there were 161 lynchings. They were an absolute form of terror, demanding that Black people either stayed in their place or as defined by the white community, or that they got out. Often business owners or landowners were targeted. Ida B. Wells's newspaper itself was targeted. The whole press was burned down, and she had to flee to Chicago. Lynchings were just in addition to the dramatic increase in arrests of Black men, thanks to the loophole in the 13th Amendment. And these arrests were often for petty offenses, but if they couldn't pay, then they were held. And because they were held, they couldn't earn money, and so they were held longer in virtual slavery. You may remember last week we talked about peonage, using those convicts of slave labor. That's what was going on. And to an extent, that's what continues to this day. The restrictions for Black people in the South, and here we have to be careful to not just target the South, not just look at the South, because a lot of these restrictions existed in the North as well, although they were often a little more genteelly prescribed or a little less brutally enforced. But they were still there. And they went far beyond travel restrictions. In 1896, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court ruling was the last word for a long time in segregation, and it formalized the idea of separate but equal. This decision affected school segregation, job limitations, housing segregation, that is to say, where one could buy a house or not. It affected marriage, and of course, voting. Now, if I step back for a second and look at marriage, maybe Chris, you can show me the next slide. Oh, and one more, we missed that one. Skip that one. There we go. Anti-miscegenation laws had existed throughout the country, though interestingly, never in New York or Connecticut, but really they'd existed from the earliest times. Virtually every northeastern state that had had anti-miscegenation laws, which is to say laws against intermarriage between races, those had been repealed before the Civil War. This is not the case, though, in many other states. After the Civil War, most of those laws, even throughout the South, were repealed. This is during Reconstruction. And as long as Reconstruction went along, there were no laws against people of different races marrying. After 1877, though, all those laws started coming right back in the South. And you can sort of see where they are and how late it was that some of them were repealed. Some of them as late as 1967, when the Supreme Court ruled that it was unconstitutional. However, even after that, some states didn't codify it. And Alabama was the last who didn't put it into their constitution that people could, that interracial marriages were legal until the year 2000. Without minimizing the damage of all the Jim Crow era laws and schemes to disenfranchise Black people, I'm going to focus on one aspect, and that is voting. From the beginning, white Southerners were quite open about wanting to disenfranchise Black voters. In the 1898 Democratic Handbook, the party leadership wrote, and I'm going to ask Chris to just go to the next slide. Party leadership wrote, when the Democratic Party went out of power, it was rare that a Negro office holder could be found in the state. And when one was found, it was in a position which did not make him obnoxious to the white people and which did not create within a desire to rule over and dominate the white man. In the 4 years of Republican fusion legislation, and in the year and a half of the Republican Populist Fusion administration, wonderful strides, and this was meant sarcastically, wonderful strides have been made in conferring office upon the Negro and in setting him up to rule over white men. They, white Republicans, do not seem to object even now to Negro school committee men having supervision of white schools. In many cases, there being 2 Negroes to 1 white man over the schools where the sons and daughters of white men are taught. We do not see how any white man can approve of that. You might want to go to the next one. White politicians used this fear of having Negro rule to agitate against Black voter rights. And you can see the cartoon that is used to make it seem scary. In 1901, at the Alabama Constitutional Convention, John B. Knox, who was the president of the convention, laid it all out. And you can go to the next quote. He said, within the limits imposed by the federal Constitution, it is our goal to establish white supremacy in this state. If we should have white supremacy, we must establish it by law and not by force or fraud. And their solution to do it by law was to enact laws establishing that any person convicted of a felony involving moral turpitude was ineligible to vote without applying to have their rights restored. The trick is, of course, they did not define moral turpitude, and it was amazing how many Black men were convicted of that crime. You can do a lot of things when you have a vague crime. You can also guess how many Black voters who applied to have their rights restored were successful. A couple of years later, Charles Aycock, the governor of North Carolina, bragged about how they had solved what he called the Negro problem. You might want to go to the next slide. He said in a speech in 1903, "We have solved the Negro problem. We have taken him out of politics and have thereby secured good government under any party and laid foundations for the future development of both races. We have secured peace and rendered prosperity a certainty. I am inclined to give to you our solution of this problem. It is first, as far as possible under the 15th Amendment, to disenfranchise him. Let the Negro learn once for all that there is unending separation of the races, that the two peoples may develop side by side to the fullest, but that they cannot intermingle." It is absolutely clear what the agenda was. They were not hiding it in any way, shape, or form. It was to completely and totally disenfranchise African Americans. The American Black Holocaust Museum has a website, and they list 8 ways in which Black voting rights were suppressed during the Jim Crow era. And if you go to the next one, first one was violence or threat of violence. There were some just horrifying pictures of the violence visited upon Black men and women who dared to vote. This one is more of the threat of violence. And if you can't see what the subtitle says, or the caption says, it says, of course, he wants to vote the Democratic ticket, just to say he had no choice in how he was voting. That was number 1, violence, and it was very effective. Number 2 was literacy tests, and if you go to the next one. Literacy tests had been used before, mostly to keep out poor people, but now they took on a new form, and that was to keep out specifically Black voters. Specifically Black voters, because if you can't see what the caption says, it says, by the way, what's that big word? Just to say that white people may have taken the test, but they always passed. Black people could have had PhDs and often couldn't pass the test, even if it was a simple thing, because the test was just a way of saying, no, you can't vote. Number 3 was property tests. It was an old standard, but it was allowed under the 15th Amendment. And very few Black people were allowed to own property, so it made it very difficult. Number 4, the grandfather clause, which is to say, if grandpa voted before 1867, then you could vote. The problem, of course, in the South was most Black people were not free before 1867, and therefore had not been allowed to vote. Certainly their grandparents had not been. Number 5 was a workaround. It was simply the Democratic Party primary. And the reason that was a workaround was because it was a pretty sure thing. If you won the Democratic primary, you were going to win the general election back in many parts of the South. But because many states defined the Democratic Party not as a political party, but as a club, they could restrict membership, and so they made themselves all white. So they were an all-white party, and they always won the general election. So whoever won the primary won the general. Number 6 is something that we're familiar with today, voter roll purges. They simply purged voters who had registered before, and when they came to the polls, they said, sorry, you're not on here, you can't vote. Number 7 was that part about former prisoners. Remember how the governor of North Carolina had said that they were simply going to, the Democratic playbook said, we're going to obey the rules, but we're going to say if you've been convicted, you can't vote. And that's what they did. That's something that is still a factor in some states to this day. Even New York says you cannot vote when you're on parole. There are a lot of states. Most states have some restriction. For some of them, it's just if you're in prison. There are only 2 states in the country where those who are imprisoned can still vote. The last of the standard Jim Crow era ways to disenfranchise voters was the poll tax. And again, poll taxes had been around a long time, well before the American Revolution. But then they had been a focus on making sure that the right people, that is to say, the landed gentry, as it were, voted, and they kept out the riffraff. Now they've changed it to simply keeping out primarily Black voters. It must be said, though, that a lot of poor white farmers also were kept out from voting, but they seemed to feel that that was a reasonable price in order to get to avoid Black voters. Well, this isn't how things end exactly. It's not the end of things, because the world kept going on. From this point on, though, Black leaders continued to write endlessly. There was this big explosion of Black presses, not only Ida B. Wells's, but W.E.B. Du Bois was writing, Booker T. Washington was writing, and they were and having speaking engagements. And then in 1909, all 3 of them were there at the establishment of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. For what it's worth, Ida B. Wells did not stay a member of that organization for long. Apparently, she was considered a bit too strident for many of the people who were in the organization. And so they were shunting her off to the side, so she just left. Meanwhile, things were getting worse for Black people, not only in the South, but pretty much all over the country. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson segregated the federal civil service, essentially closing that avenue of employment off. But the overt racism of the South drove a second exodus starting in 1915, and it was called the Great Migration. Instead of moving west, however, this time they moved north. Northern states employed more subtle methods to alienate African Americans, including redlining methods, directing people through banks into other specific areas. But New York schools were pretty segregated, and today are some of the most segregated in the country. And it continued all the way through the building projects of the state. You may well have heard of a man named Robert Moses, who had a lot of public building projects. And he made liberal use of eminent domain. In many cases, though, what that really meant was destroying Black neighborhoods, taking Black homes so that he could build roads or parks or whatever he had in mind. I'm going to end it soon by talking about World War I. At the end of World War I, soldiers returning from battle, especially Black soldiers who had been treated very differently by their French allies and their English allies than by their own countrymen. They had this whole new way of seeing themselves, and they came home expecting to be part of those heroes' welcomes, the parades and everything. That hope was that since they'd proven themselves patriotic and more than capable, the nation would see them differently. It didn't happen. Instead, from 1919 on, for at least the next decade, racial tensions exploded. The summer of 1919 became so violent against against African American communities that it became known as the Red Summer. And this went across the whole country. We've recently observed the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre from 1921. That era was extremely dangerous. At any rate, one other thing was going on at that time too. There was yet another pandemic going on. In fact, I should have mentioned that Ida B. Wells's parents were killed in a yellow fever pandemic. And that year also women gained the right to vote. For Blacks, however, the words of the 15th Amendment had little weight, and voting remained an elusive goal. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Masood.
Thank you, Chuck. And whereas Chuck has focused largely on legislative matters and rules and policies that were done at the state level or in counties, I'm going to backtrack and I'm going to guide you through a kind of overview of movements, ways in which people were able to activate activity, generate activity around the matters of civil rights, of racial justice, and there's an overlap here. Generally, when people think about civil rights movements, they often think about the 50s and the 60s. But actually, there were movements that happened earlier than that. Some that would begin as early as during the early 1800s. But we began to have more momentum when we come to the figures like Ida B. Wells. And as Chuck has mentioned, she was an extraordinary woman, very gifted, was a journalist, owned a paper, was an educator. And there were three areas that she really focused on in terms of generating a following: sexism, racism, and violence. Those three areas: sexism, racism, and violence. In terms of sexism, she began to awaken women to their value and actually formed a group of women who began to think about their own agency and how they could move forward in their lives more freely, in spite of the kinds of laws and other kinds of restrictions that they had. Racism as a whole was something that she tackled, particularly issues of violence, as Chuck has mentioned, around the practice of lynching. And so her work, her writings, the work that she did through her publishing company, all involved those three areas, actually: sexism, racism, and violence. And not only did she do work here in the United States, but she even made trips to England, where she also spoke about what was happening in this country. It was an important thing to raise women's sense of self-value, pride, because that was something that had been greatly diminished throughout the time of slavery. And so not only were the shackles of chains having to be broken, but also psychological, emotional shackles. And I'll say more about that a little later. As Chuck has also mentioned, Ida B. Wells was also one of the founders of the NAACP. Interestingly enough, in 1920, Ida B. Wells was posthumously honored with a Pulitzer Prize for outstanding and courageous reporting of the horrific and vicious violence against African Americans during the era of lynching. There's more to be said about each of the people that we will cover. I have given you a resource sheet. I sent it out last night. And on that sheet, there is an excellent work which covers the work, the life and work of Ida B. Wells. And I urge you to take time to get that book and read it. Another person who began a movement was Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, who was born in Jamaica in 1887, was a political activist there, a publisher, a journalist, entrepreneur, and a very powerful orator. He founded an organization called the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, the UNIAACL. And it was commonly just known as the UNIA. He came to the United States, lived in New York City, and founded a branch of this organization. He became a rather controversial person. One of the things about him, a major thing, was that he was just fed up with white domination. And he represents a kind of tension that has been a part of civil rights movements for over 100 years. And that is those who were really seeking integration, wanting to be able to enter the organizations, communities of whites, institutions, and others who really thought that that would never happen and that there needed to be separation. And so that was the case with Marcus Garvey. He was on the part of separation. And it was so much to the point where he began to think about taking African Americans back to Africa. And so there was this connection with Liberia that began to be established, where African Americans were returning to Africa. He encouraged businesses not to depend upon white structures, to develop Black businesses that had their own financial footing. So there was this philosophical conflict that was going on between integration and separatism. One of the great criticisms that grew up around him was that his ideas about separatism were very much favored by the KKK, who also wanted there to be separatism, segregation. And so among some Black leaders, he was not favored, and there was tension there. He still became a major force because he at least brought to consciousness the oppression that was there with segregation, or I should say the white system that was oppressing Blacks. Only his solution, he thought, was to go away, to go back to Africa. When we move forward, another major person that almost everybody knows about is Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was also a person, along with Malcolm X, but the two of them represented this different approach, the dichotomy, you might say, of one pressing for integration, and another one, initially at least, stressing a more militant kind of style. With Martin Luther King, there was a very important element, a very important message that he taught that had to do with freedom. And it had to do with freedom of the mind. I made mention earlier about being freed from the iron shackles that shackled bodies, but he spoke about the unshackling of the mind. And this became a very important part of the thinking and actions, particularly in the 60s, of the attitudes towards Blackness taking on a new form. For instance, before the 60s, many minds of Black people were shackled in terms of Blackness. To be Black was thought of as being ugly, being dirty, something to be ashamed of. But in the midst of the work that he was doing, a movement began to rise up in the community where Black became beautiful. Black became something that was honorable. And the phrase, the slogan, "Black is beautiful," did emerge. And there was a whole sense of recapturing hair. Hair did not have to be straight. Hair could be naturally curly. There was a time when the curls were thought of as being kinky. And that was a negative kind of pejorative statement. But there began to be an appreciation for our curly hair. And fleshy lips and rounder bodies. So there was an appreciation of a broader sense of aesthetic, that beauty was no longer seen as gauged by what was European, but an appreciation for what was African. And so that began to influence art and design and architecture and clothing, fashion. Kente cloth began to be seen, where people were no longer ashamed to be a part of African heritage, and they began to draw upon that as a sense of pride. And all of this represented Dr. King's understanding too of the unshackling of the mind, as well as the unshackling of chains. With Malcolm X, there was a sense initially, because of his association with the Nation of Islam, that there would be separation. But after he began to become more attuned to his own religious tradition, which was Islam, he began to realize that Islam was not a racist religion. His Hajj to Arabia opened his eyes to Mecca, opened his eyes to the fact that Muslims were of many different shades and colors, with black eyes, brown eyes, blue eyes, gray eyes, and coming from different parts of the world. And that began to change his understanding about wholeness and unity and a non-separation of people. And so there was, coupled with that, a great sense of pride in calling the community to come together, and of building businesses that they could be proud of as well. This really evolved. He was tremendously effective in helping what became known as the Black Power movement, which really, I'll have to compress this because there were many different parts of that movement. But one of the movements that he really did have a tremendous impact on, or one that he helped to influence, was the Black Panthers. And of course, you know, people have a very negative attitude about the Black Panthers, but it was certainly true that this was a party that grew up to defend the Black community against police brutality. And they were also there to help the community in terms of the neighborhood, of protecting them against the unjust policing that happened, and were also a part of developing programs for children and addressing food injustice. Community health services and clinics were developed, even up through the time of AIDS and HIV. They wanted people to be brought to trial and tried with juries made up of Black people rather than of whites who were out of touch with the realities and the experiences of the Black community and with prejudices that were already there. Now, I'm going to interject something here, because in the midst of this Black Power movement emerged, you might say, a Black Power movement within the Episcopal Church, known as the Union of Black Episcopalians. This group was formed in 1968, right in the midst of all of the movements that were bringing about a greater sense of economic power, of intellectual power, of social power. And what was being realized within the Episcopal Church, and had been for a long time, was that the church itself had been segregated. It went all the way back. If I had time, what I would suggest you do was to look up the history of Absalom Jones and how, as far back as the 1700s and the early 1800s, Blacks had to really work hard for their place in the Episcopal Church. It was not unusual for there to be two congregations in small towns, one white and one Black, in very small towns. And it was not the norm at all for Black clergy to be trained in the normal seminaries, but special schools were developed to train Black clergy. And that happened for a long time. And related to that was the experience of Black clergy being relegated to serve Black congregations only. It was a very long time before Blacks were permitted to serve white congregations, particularly as rectors. And it was much longer before there were Black bishops. Oddly enough, even in 1978, in my own seminary experience, during a review process in my middler year, one of my professors, whom I dearly loved and respected, and he did of me, very innocently said, "We're so glad you're here, and we know that you're going to be a wonderful priest for your people." And in that moment, there was a great deal of anger that I felt, and disappointment too, because I knew this person to be a person who was really fond of me and knew that I was doing well, but it represented an idea and a position that had been held for a long time. And even though that was 1979, that was said innocently on one hand, but unconsciously. There were other movements that happened as well, as you know, that coming down to our own day, the one that is getting such traction right now has to do with Black Lives Matter. And that's come out of a whole period of time of Black communities under the siege of the police, and of people being afraid and being angered because of the unnecessary killings and the issues around racial profiling. There is much more to be said about all of this, but I would really like you to take a look at those references that I've given you, to look at how these issues have been addressed as we have moved through the decades. I'm going to have to pause here, though, and turn it back over to Chuck.
Thank you, Masood. We're going to change directions here for a minute, if you will, or for a few minutes. You may remember I mentioned that Ida B. Wells's parents died in a yellow fever epidemic when she was 16 years old. We are in the middle of a pandemic now. And although it's been a long time in a sense since we've had something this dramatic, pandemics are things that have happened throughout the country over the last several centuries. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But when this pandemic hit, we found ourselves, our reparations committee, meeting via Zoom rather than in person, we realized that retreats like the one Father Masood and I are doing right now weren't possible in person. And we also realized that the focus of New Yorkers was really not on civil rights. It was not on police violence at the time. It was all on the pandemic. And we wanted to be able to honor that and respect that. And we were trying to find different ways to pay attention to the ministry of the reparations committee, and yet also honor the suffering going on in the pandemic. Part of our result was doing some research on pandemics in the time that we have been focusing on in reparations, which is the slavery era and the post-slavery era. And lo and behold, we discovered several pandemics and a pattern that is very familiar, a pattern of denial, a pattern of blaming the victims, a pattern of not wanting to upset business, and a pattern of keeping what we call today essential workers in the eye of the storm, even as those who have the means escape. So we came up with the idea of maybe a monologue. If you ever saw the play A New York Lamentation, you're familiar with one of the characters, Peter Williams. And we wanted to bring out him again and let him tell his experience of two pandemics and what it meant for him to be a Black man in New York in the midst of all of this. And with that in mind, I'm going to bring back the man who brought alive Peter Williams the first time, Dorian Lake, who is a marvelous actor, and he is going to perform this monologue live. So I will leave it to Dorian, and I'll mute myself.
Time. They say time heals all wounds. Of course, they also say that what does not kill you makes you stronger. I am not so sure. And I say this from the perspective of one who has been dead a very long time. Allow me to introduce myself. I am the Reverend Peter Williams, late rector of St. Philip's Episcopal Church, located these days in Harlem. When I served there, that was from 1826 until my death in 1840, St. Philip's was in the Five Points district, near Columbus Park and Chinatown today. You may have met me a couple of years ago in a play called A New York Lamentation, which was all about slavery in our state. Oh, I still lament the racial inequality brought on by the sin of slavery. Time has not healed that. I know you lament it still, but you have something else to lament these days as well, a pandemic. I understand. Believe me, I understand. You see, I lived through two horrific pandemics myself, back in the days of slavery. These are egregious burdens to bear, worthy of lamentation. I only hope with my brief visit to bring you encouragement, perspective, and fortitude. My first word of encouragement is this: this will pass. All epidemics do. Most people will survive, though it will not always feel like it. And if my experience counts for anything, you will see the best and the worst in people. Let me just tell you how it was in my day. Back when I was a child, the yellow fever epidemic hit. It was about 1795 when it got to New York. It had ravaged Philadelphia before, so we knew what was coming. New York set up a health commission to keep Philadelphians out of the city. It did little good. Disease is no respecter of borders or blockades. And sure enough, the fever hit us hard, like it hit them. By the end of the first year, 2,086 New Yorkers had died. But you would never know it by the leadership, not at first. They refused to admit that anything was wrong. It would be bad for business, you know. So first they said there was no yellow fever in New York. Then they said that there were only a few cases. Then, when the number grew, they said the change of season would make it stop. Eventually, when they realized only certain districts were particularly hard hit, they claimed that it was due to the immoral character of the sufferers or their weak constitutions. Can you guess which districts were hardest hit? New York in those days may not have been huge, but it had already separated the rich from the poor. The poor lived by the docks in squalid conditions, and in 1795, slavery was still very much alive in New York, with 42% of New York City families owning other people. But it was the free blacks and those who had escaped slavery and who had run away to New York who were hit hardest, because they were forced to live in what today you would call the slums. When people started dying in earnest in August, rich folks fled the city. Many of the wealthy city dwellers owned estates up and down the Hudson, so they sent their families north to the country. One young doctor at Bellevue, Elihu Smith, estimated that 12 to 15,000 people fled the city. He wrote to a friend, "Wherever you go, the fever is the invariable and unceasing topic of conversation. People collect in groups to talk it over and to frighten each other into fever or flight." Now, I will be fair. Some white folks, including Dr. Smith, stayed behind to help. Some of them, including Dr. Smith himself, died in the course of their duties. And let me tell you, yellow fever was not a death you would wish on anyone. It took 9 years for the epidemic to end. Maybe that's because every time it eased up, business leaders pushed to reopen trade, and the fever stormed back to life. When it finally did pass, New York's leaders let the Board of Health fall to disuse. They went along as if nothing had happened. Oh, some things changed. Legal slavery ended in New York. Sure, some people still escaped slavery in the South and made their way north where they could blend in. But it was the Irish immigrants who came in by the thousands, fleeing the tyranny of the English. The population grew from 60,000 in 1795 to nearly 250,000 in 1832. Anyway, in 1832, cholera was devastating Europe, and so New York's leaders ordered that no European ships be allowed to dock in New York. They were looking the wrong direction, though, and missed all the ships coming down the Hudson from Canada, a country where Europeans had already brought the disease. So cholera came from above, infecting towns all along the way, till it reached Manhattan. Now, remember all those immigrants? Remember all the newly freed slaves from New York? Remember all those people who escaped slavery? They were all living crammed together in the poorest districts of the city, mostly the Five Points district where my church, St. Philip's, served. 5 Points had been built over a large filled-in pond. The land stank and kept sinking, which caused houses to sag. So the wealthy abandoned it and filled it with poor and the undesirable. 5 Points was crowded, filthy, so naturally became the epicenter of the epidemic. Rich folks just knew it was because we who lived there led such immoral and intemperate lifestyles. One of our civic leaders, John Pintard, wrote that the disease is almost exclusively confined to the lower classes of intemperate, dissolute, and filthy people huddled together like swine in their polluted habitations. Those sickened must be cured or die off, and being chiefly of the very scum of the city, the quicker they're dispatched, the sooner the malady will cease. And to just confirm it for that, the fact that we black folks were, how they put it, foreordained to suffer due to their social and genetic inferiority, they said the Negro's innate character invited cholera. He was, with few exceptions, filthy and careless in his personal habits, lazy and ignorant by temperament. A natural fatalist, moreover, he took no steps to protect himself from disease and shared, to an exaggerated extent, the distaste of the poor for hospitals and the medical profession. Funny thing is, back during that 1795 pandemic, the only people they could find to be nurses were the black folk. In Philadelphia, the mayor himself had asked Reverend Absalom Jones to recruit grave diggers and nurses, for white patients, of course, because no white person would take on the task. Philadelphia's elites later criticized the nurses and grave diggers for having the temerity to ask payment for their services. In like manner, during the cholera pandemic of 1832, it was we, the poor, the churches, and the doctors who cared for the sick. Catholic nuns tended the Irish immigrants. Our church fed the hungry who had lost everything in the calamity. Some of the richer Protestant churches thought the matter too distasteful and fled upstate. Another similarity between 1795 and 1832 was that the state tried to play down the disease. They didn't want to scare away businesses. They said it wasn't as bad as fearmongers claimed. But you can hide the truth for only so long. Finally, they declared an emergency and set up field hospitals. Can you guess what happened next? That's right, businesses pushed to open back up as soon as possible, with predictable results. More death, more pain, and mostly among the poor. But did the epidemic change things? The city saw the importance of having a clean water source and began working on the Croton Reservoir. That was something. They started cleaning streets too. Otherwise, not much changed for us, the poor and the black. Just 2 years after the pandemic, 300 white rioters stormed St. Philip's, smashed the stained glass windows, hacked the pews to pieces, and toppled the altar. All because my work to abolish slavery. Just as in 1795, the poorest of the poor were blamed for the epidemic, forced to work the most dangerous jobs during the epidemic, and then belittled afterwards. So, sisters and brothers, I understand your plight. As far as I can tell, people are acting in your time of distress about the same way they acted in mine. Deny there's a problem, blame the weak, push to reopen too soon, repeat. Depressing, isn't it? So what good news have I to share? Well, as I said, you will get through this, and good people will help, even at personal sacrifice. May we all make our goal to be and support those people. But you must be steadfast. Once this passes, the principalities and powers of the world will remain. The good Lord needs you to care for yourselves so you can continue bringing the good news of Christ's justice, equity, and peace. Take heart, my beloved, but do so with open eyes, and know that as the Lord watches over you, so will I. Good night.
Thank you, sir. Now it's time for us to prepare to go into the breakout rooms. Chris, will you put on the screen the questions? As you go into your breakout rooms, I know that you will be with people that you were not with before, in most cases. We regret that on one hand, but this is an opportunity for you to get to meet other people, a broader group of people than you would have. In your group, you'll have 20 minutes, 25 minutes actually, and in that time, I'd like you just to take just a wee bit of time to introduce yourselves, perhaps just your name, the church or institution you're from, and what city or town you're from, so that there's a sense of context. And then I'd like you to spend the rest of your time with what you see here. It says here that we have given an overview of the racial relationships in the United States. What have you observed or experienced that speaks to the unevenness of access or equality between the races? And really, rather than it being a second question, it's really a restatement of that in another way. What doors have you seen or experienced open for some and closed to others? But that's really the same question being asked in a different kind of way. Reflect on those questions a bit. You've heard history, you've heard about movements, you've heard about legislation, but now I want you to think about your own personal observations and experiences of what it means to encounter these prejudicial events. Go now into your rooms. Thank you. And we'll be back in at about 25 after. Well, welcome back, everyone. So glad that you were here this evening. We will be continuing next week in a different kind of way. So in preparation for next week's session, I ask you to look at the second page of the resources that I sent out to you. On the back of the sheet, you will see a video section. And I recommend that between now and next week, you listen to the 3 videos, parts 1, 2, and 3. They're only about a half hour long each. These are done by Professor Werney Reed, who is at Virginia Tech, and it's the director of Race and Society Center there. He has done some remarkable work, and these 3 videos come from a program that he did for the diocese, the Episcopal Diocese of Southwestern Virginia a couple of years ago. And so I ask you to take the time to do that, because they will set us up for what we will do next week. Okay? The Lord be with you. Let us pray.
And also with you.
Also with you.
Also with you.
God, we give you thanks for your world, the world that you have made. May your spirit rest upon each of us. We will receive the gift of your world as friend, as brother, as sister. Guide us in our attempt to provide for a more just society where everyone is accepted, where policies of all institutions reflect your mercy, your generosity, your compassion, your justice. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we pray. Amen.